Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength found in quiet moments. In today's story, a seemingly ordinary diner on a remote stretch of Highway 40 becomes the setting for an unforgettable encounter. A group of bikers, loud and brash, targets a quiet man sitting alone. But what they don't realize is that beneath his calm demeanor lies a lesson in respect and restraint they'll never forget. Join us as we unfold this powerful story. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The wind was sharp that afternoon, the kind that bites through even the thickest layers and leaves a chill lingering in your bones. James pulled his truck into the gravel parking lot of Bill's Diner, a worn-out roadside spot nestled along Highway 40 in rural Oklahoma. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, where the checkered floors and faded neon open sign told stories of busier days long past. James parked in the far corner of the lot, where the gravel crunched under his tires. He sat for a moment, taking in the sight of the diner, his dark eyes scanning its weathered facade. A lone gas station stood nearby, its pumps rusted and forgotten, leaning slightly to one side like relics of another era. James adjusted his cap, grabbed his wallet from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the truck. Inside, the diner was just as he expected. Vinyl booths with cracked seams lined the walls, and a jukebox sat silent in the corner, its lights flickering weakly. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried grease, a scent that somehow felt comforting despite its age. A waitress wiped down the counter, her tired eyes and practiced motions betraying years of routine. Behind her, the short-order cook flipped burgers on a grill that sizzled with the kind of familiarity only locals truly appreciated. The bell above the door jingled loudly as James stepped in, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Heads turned toward him, eyes lingering a little too long. There were no smiles or welcoming nods, just the kind of stares that weighed heavier than words, curious, cautious, and laced with something unspoken. At a corner table, a group of bikers sat draped in leather vests and sunglasses, their laughter fading as they noticed James. Their attention followed him as he walked calmly to a booth by the window, his movements unhurried, his posture relaxed. James chose his seat deliberately, facing the door, a habit ingrained in him. Though he didn't expect trouble. He never did. But trouble had a way of finding him, especially in places like this. The waitress approached, her notepad tapping nervously against her palm. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat, though her eyes darted toward the bikers. "Cheeseburger and fries," James said softly. "And a coffee. Black." She scribbled the order quickly, her gaze flicking back to the bikers as if gauging their interest in her new customer. James gave her a faint smile, one meant to reassure her, though he could tell it didn't quite land. She muttered something about bringing the coffee right away and disappeared toward the counter. Behind him, the bikers had started up again, their voices louder now. One of them, a large man with a beard that stretched to his chest, leaned back in his chair, speaking just loud enough to be heard across the room. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, his lips curling into a grin. "Looks like we've got ourselves a tourist." Laughter followed, low and guttural. James didn't flinch. He traced the rim of his coffee cup when it arrived. His shoulders relaxed, his focus seemingly on the steam rising from the dark liquid. But the room hadn't let him be. The air felt heavier, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. "Hey, buddy," the bearded man called out. "You deaf? Or just rude?" The waitress returned briefly, setting James's plate down with trembling hands. He offered her another small smile and a quiet thank you. She nodded quickly and stepped away, retreating behind the counter where she stood frozen, her eyes darting between James and the bikers. James took a slow sip of his coffee, his calm demeanor an almost tangible shield. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he wouldn't invite it. But he knew trouble didn't need an invitation, it thrived on opportunities. Outside, a truck rumbled past, its tires crunching gravel. Inside, the tension thickened. The bikers' laughter had stopped, replaced by a calculated silence. They were waiting, testing, their words daring him to respond. James didn't. His stillness seemed to provoke them further. The bearded man slammed his chair back and stood, his boots heavy against the floor as he swaggered toward James's booth. His shadow loomed large over the table. The other bikers leaned back, eager for a show. "Hey," the man said, his voice sharp. "I'm talking to you, boy." The word hit the air like a slap, deliberate and cruel. James set his coffee down slowly, his movements measured, deliberate. When he looked up, his gaze locked with the man's, calm but unyielding. "Something I can help you with?" James asked, his tone even, almost polite. For a moment, the biker faltered. Something in James's eyes, something steady and unbroken, made him hesitate. But the man quickly masked his unease with a sneer. "You're sitting where you don't belong," he said. "Don't you know how things work around here?" James didn't respond immediately. He held the man's gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle. Finally, he exhaled quietly. "I'm just here for lunch," he said, his voice calm. But the calm wasn't what the man wanted. It wasn't what any of them wanted. The storm was coming, and James knew it was only a matter of time before the first drop fell. The air in Bill's diner felt like it had frozen, thick with tension as James held the biker's gaze. The bearded man, who seemed used to intimidating anyone in his path, looked momentarily thrown off by the calm, quiet resolve staring back at him. But pride is a stubborn thing, and he wasn't about to back down. "Well, looks like we got ourselves a tough guy," the biker sneered, his voice louder now as if trying to reclaim the upper hand. He leaned closer, invading James's space, the smell of sweat and cigarettes clinging to his leather vest. "Why don't you show us just how tough you are?" Behind the counter, the waitress fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting between James and the advancing biker. She reached for the phone, her trembling fingers hovering over the receiver. But the cook shook his head at her from the kitchen window, silently warning her not to escalate things. James, unbothered, picked up a fry from his plate and took a slow bite, his composure unshaken. The deliberate calm only fueled the biker's frustration. "You deaf boy," the man barked, slamming his fist on the table. The impact rattled the salt and pepper shakers. But James's expression didn't change. Finally, James placed the fry back on the plate and folded his hands in front of him. "I told you. I'm just here for lunch," he said evenly. "That's all." The words were simple, but the way James said them carried weight, like a warning wrapped in politeness. The other bikers, seated at their table, exchanged glances. They were grinning, but there was a nervous energy in the air now. A sense that something wasn't quite right. Even they could sense it, this wasn't going to end the way they thought. The leader, emboldened by the silence of his crew, reached forward, grabbing at James's collar. But before his hand could make contact, James moved. It happened in a blink. James's hand shot up, gripping the man's wrist with a strength that stopped him cold. The biker's eyes widened in shock, his bravado faltering as he realized just how solid James's grip was. "Don't," James said softly, his voice low but firm. The single word hung in the air, and for a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The biker yanked his arm back with a snarl, trying to save face. "Think you're tough? Huh," he spat, flexing his hand. "You have no idea who you're messing with." James leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "Neither do you," he replied, his tone still quiet, almost casual. But there was something in his eyes, a glint of steel, that made the words land like a warning siren. The bearded man turned back to his crew, his pride pushing him forward. "Get up, boys," he growled. Chairs scraped loudly as the other bikers rose. 5 of them in total. their boots thudding against the floor as they formed a loose semicircle around James's booth. Behind the counter, the waitress whispered, "Please, don't," but her voice was drowned out by the growing tension. The cook had stopped flipping burgers, his spatula frozen midair as he watched. The leader cracked his knuckles, smirking as he took a step closer. "You've got two choices, pal. Walk out now, or we take this outside." James didn't flinch. He adjusted his baseball cap slightly and said, "I'd rather finish my lunch." The quiet confidence of the statement made the leader's smirk falter. "Fine," he snarled, gesturing to the others. "We'll do it here." They closed in, their shadows stretching across James's table. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as every patron in the diner watched, frozen in place. It was the kind of tension that made time feel like it had slowed. But for James, it didn't slow. He moved. The leader lunged first, swinging a fist aimed at James's face. James slid out of the booth in one fluid motion, catching the man's arm mid-swing. With a sharp twist and a well-placed step, he redirected the man's momentum, sending him sprawling into a nearby table with a loud crash. The diner erupted into chaos. One biker charged from the side, but James sidestepped effortlessly, planting an elbow into the man's ribs and sending him stumbling backward into a booth. Another came from behind with a chair raised, but James ducked, grabbing the chair and yanking it free before the man could swing. A controlled shove sent the attacker sprawling to the floor. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, and precise. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary aggression. James moved like a man who had done this before, countless times, and the bikers were no match for him. As the last of them hesitated, their earlier confidence now replaced by fear, James straightened his posture, his calm demeanor unbroken. He glanced at the leader, who was groaning on the floor, and said quietly, "I told you to back off." The leader, clutching his ribs, looked up at James with wide eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice shaky. James adjusted his cap again and replied, "Just a guy getting lunch." The diner was deathly silent after the chaos. The kind of silence that came when the dust settled and everyone tried to process what had just happened. The bikers, sprawled on the floor or slumped against booths, groaned as they tried to collect themselves. Their earlier bravado was nowhere to be seen, replaced by confusion, embarrassment, and pain. James, meanwhile, stood near his table, calm and composed. He reached for his coffee cup and took a deliberate sip, his movements slow and steady as though nothing unusual had just occurred. He set the cup back on the table, adjusted the brim of his cap, and turned to face the room. The leader of the bikers, Randy, was trying to push himself upright. His pride was clearly more bruised than his body, though the way he winced with every movement suggested otherwise. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice carrying a mix of anger and bewilderment. James looked at him with a calm expression, one that didn't gloat or mock. "I'm just a guy trying to finish his lunch," he said evenly. Behind the counter, the waitress finally seemed to find her voice. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked hesitantly, her tone filled with a mix of awe and concern. James turned to her and gave a faint smile. "I'm fine," he replied. "Sorry about the mess." Her eyes flicked to the bikers, who were still recovering on the floor. I think they're the ones who should be apologizing." James didn't respond, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet acknowledgement that the waitress was right. He looked back at Randy, who was now sitting on the floor, his back against the booth. Randy glared up at James, though the fire in his eyes had dimmed considerably. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat, his voice shaky. "You think you're better than us?" James crouched down slightly, meeting Randy's gaze. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "No," he said. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I do know that respect goes a long way. And maybe, just maybe, it's time you learned that." Randy opened his mouth as if to respond but quickly closed it again. He seemed to sense that there was no point in arguing. Not now. The other patrons in the diner, who had been frozen in place throughout the ordeal, began to stir. A man in a plaid shirt, someone who looked like he'd spent a lifetime working the fields, spoke up. "I ain't ever seen anything like that," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. The waitress stepped out from behind the counter, still clutching her notepad. She hesitated for a moment before approaching James. "Sir, can I get you anything? A fresh burger? Maybe?" she asked, her voice still shaky but kind. James shook his head. "No need," he said. "This one's just fine." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them neatly under the edge of his plate. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking toward the door. The bell above the door jingled softly as James stepped outside. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way back to his truck. One of the younger bikers, who had fled the diner earlier, was standing near his motorcycle, watching James with wide eyes. The boy didn't say a word, just stepped aside as James climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and James paused for a moment, glancing in the rearview mirror. Inside, he could see the patrons of the diner gathered at the windows, watching him leave. He didn't linger, though. He shifted into gear and drove off, the truck kicking up a small cloud of dust as it merged back onto the highway. Back inside the diner, the silence lingered for a moment longer before the murmurs began. People whispered to each other, recounting what they'd just witnessed as if trying to make sense of it. The waitress looked at the mess left behind, the overturned chairs, the scattered plates, and shook her head in disbelief. Randy and his crew slowly began to pick themselves up, their earlier swagger entirely gone. One of the bikers, the wiry man with the stringy hair, muttered, "What just happened?" Randy didn't answer. He just stared at the door James had walked through, his face pale and unreadable. Finally, he muttered, "Let's get out of here." The bikers stumbled out of the diner, leaving behind a mix of broken pride and uneasy respect. For the other patrons, the story was just beginning. It would be told and retold, growing with each version. But the core of it would remain, the quiet man who taught a lesson without raising his voice. As James drove down the empty stretch of highway, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He didn't think about the bikers or the diner. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere quieter. To him, it wasn't about proving anything. It never had been. It was about living with purpose, about choosing respect and composure even when the world tried to drag you down. And in his quiet strength, he found peace. As James drove away into the fading sunset, the dust from the diner parking lot settled, but the impact of his actions lingered. Inside Bill's diner, the patrons began to find their voices again, speaking in hushed tones about the quiet man who had entered their lives briefly yet left a profound mark. The bikers, humbled and subdued, learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, one about respect, restraint, and the strength found in calm resolve. For James, it wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about living by principles, showing that true power doesn't come from intimidation but from control and integrity. The road stretched ahead of him, endless and free, as he left the moment behind, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of having made a difference. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of courage, wisdom, and lessons worth sharing.